Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, or letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honored to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart or just a few time zones away? Both listening as the stars come out. If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. The medieval mind approached law differently than we do today. Where we seek consistency and precedent, they often relied on tradition, divine judgment, and what we might charitably call creative problem-solving. Laws were not merely rules to be followed, but reflections of deeply held beliefs about morality, social order, and the very nature of truth itself. Consider the peculiar case of animal trials, a legal tradition that flourished across medieval Europe for several centuries. Yes, you heard correctly. Animals could be put on trial, complete with legal representation, formal proceedings, and even appeals. In 1386, a pig in Falaise, France, was tried and executed for harming an infant. The pig was dressed in human clothing for the execution, as if to emphasize its moral culpability. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader legal framework that held animals accountable for their actions in ways that seem almost fantastical to us now. These animal trials were not mere curiosities, but reflected deep-seated beliefs about justice and moral order. Medieval people believed that all of creation was bound by divine law. And when that law was broken, even by a beast, justice demanded satisfaction. Pigs that harmed children, bulls that injured farmers, and even insects that destroyed crops could find themselves defendants in formal legal proceedings. The legal representation provided to these animal defendants was often surprisingly thorough. In 1750, a female donkey was tried alongside her human accomplice in France. The donkey's defense attorney argued successfully that she had been an unwilling participant, and she was acquitted while the man faced punishment. Witnesses even testified to the donkey's good character and previous virtuous behavior. The trials of inanimate objects, but animals were not the only unexpected defendants in medieval courts. Inanimate objects, too, could find themselves on trial. If a sword caused someone's demise, the weapon itself might be tried and banished from the realm. Bells that had rung during violent storms were sometimes put on trial for their role in summoning destructive weather. Trees that had fallen and harmed passers-by could be formally prosecuted and sentenced to be cut down and removed. These object trials reflected a worldview where the boundaries between the animate and inanimate, the moral and amoral, were far more fluid than our modern understanding would suggest. Every element of creation was seen as part of a grand moral order. And when that order was disrupted, the law stepped in to restore balance. Trial by ordeal, divine justice through suffering. The concept of trial by ordeal added another layer of strangeness to medieval justice. These were legal procedures designed to determine guilt or innocence through divine intervention. The underlying belief was that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer harm during these tests, making them a form of supernatural lie detector. Trial by hot iron was one such ordeal. The accused would be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a specified distance, usually 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and examined after 3 days. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If it showed signs of infection or poor healing, guilt was assumed. Trial by cold water involved throwing the accused into a body of water while bound. If they floated, they were considered guilty, as the pure water was rejecting them. If they sank and nearly drowned, they were posthumously declared innocent. This presented what we might call a significant design flaw in the justice system, as innocence could only be proven through near drowning. Perhaps most dramatically, trial by combat allowed disputes to be settled through physical battle. This could involve the actual disputants fighting each other, or they could hire champions to fight on their behalf. The belief was that God would ensure victory for the righteous party. Interestingly, this practice was not limited to men. Women, clergy, and the elderly could all demand trial by combat, though they typically employed champions rather than fighting personally. The strange lives of medieval executioners. Legal status of various professions in medieval Europe also produced some wonderfully strange laws. Executioners, for instance, occupied a peculiar position in society. While their services were essential for the functioning of the justice system, they were often considered ritually unclean and were subjected to numerous restrictions in many German states. Executioners were required to live outside town walls and could only enter the town to perform their duties. They were forbidden from touching food in markets, as their touch was believed to contaminate goods. Interestingly, executioners often supplemented their income by working as healers and veterinarians. Their intimate knowledge of anatomy gained through their primary profession made them surprisingly effective medical practitioners. This created the paradoxical situation where the same person might end a life in the morning and save one in the afternoon. Creative solutions to medieval debt. The legal treatment of debt in medieval Europe produced some particularly inventive solutions. In parts of medieval France, a debtor who could not pay might be required to sit unclothed in the town square while crying out their shame to all who passed. This public humiliation was designed both as punishment and as a way to encourage charitable contributions from passers-by. Some regions developed the concept of debt inheritance in ways that seem almost surreal today. In certain parts of medieval Germany, unpaid debts could be inherited by the debtor's children, but only if they had been present when the debt was incurred. This led to the strange practice of excluding children from important financial discussions to protect them from future liability. Market, justice, and poetic punishment. The regulation of markets and trade produced its own category of unusual laws. In medieval London, a punishment for selling bad food was often poetic justice taken to extremes. Bakers who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf hung around their necks. Brewers who watered down their ale could be forced to drink only their own inferior product for a specified period. The medieval understanding of property rights also led to some fascinating legal concepts. The doctrine of treasure trove held that any valuable object found buried in the ground belonged to the crown, based on the assumption that it had been hidden with the intention of retrieval. However, if the treasure was found above ground, it belonged to the finder, leading to complex legal debates about exactly what constituted buried versus merely hidden. The harsh reality of medieval food. The medieval world was one of stark contrasts when it came to food. While kings and nobles feasted on elaborate banquets with exotic spices and multiple courses, the vast majority of people lived on the edge of starvation, their meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gruel. This disparity wasn't merely about wealth. It was a reflection of an entire social system built on inequality. For the common peasant, meat was an extraordinary luxury. A family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but these animals were far too valuable to slaughter regularly. Instead, they provided eggs, milk, and the occasional offspring that could be sold for much-needed coin. When meat did appear on the peasant table, it was usually during religious festivals, or when an animal was too old or sick to serve any other purpose. Even then, every scrap was used, from organ meats to blood puddings, as nothing could be wasted in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. The preservation of food presented another monumental challenge. Without refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation to keep their food from spoiling. Salt itself was expensive and often of poor quality, filled with impurities that could make preserved meats taste terrible or even cause illness. Fish were packed in barrels with heavy salt, creating a product that bore little resemblance to fresh seafood. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented into sauerkraut, while fruits were dried into leathery strips that could last through the winter months. The problem of food adulteration, but perhaps the most insidious problem, was the widespread adulteration of food. Unscrupulous merchants and bakers, driven by poverty and desperation, regularly cut corners to maximize their profits. Bread, the staple of the medieval diet, was often stretched with sawdust, chalk, ground acorns, or even bone meal. These additives not only made the bread less nutritious, but could also be dangerous to consume. Similarly, ale and wine were frequently watered down, leaving consumers with weak, unpalatable drinks that provided little refreshment or nutrition. The story of Eleanor, a fictional but representative alewife, illustrates these challenges perfectly. Struggling to support her family after her husband's passing, Eleanor found herself faced with rising grain prices and dwindling customers. Desperate to make her ale last longer and increase her profits, she began watering down her brewed at first. The deception went unnoticed, but word soon spread about the weak, tasteless ale. Her once loyal customers began seeking other establishments, and Eleanor's reputation was ruined. Eventually, she was forced to close her business, leaving her family in even more desperate circumstances. Enforcement and regulation. Authorities did attempt to regulate food quality through laws like the Assize of Bread and Ale, which set standards for weight, price, and quality. Violators could face fines, public humiliation and pillory, or even corporal punishment. In some cases, dishonest bakers were dragged through the streets with their substandard loaves hung around their necks as a warning to others. However, enforcement was inconsistent and often ineffective, as the underlying economic pressures that drove people to adulterate their products remained unchanged. Seasonal hardships and the hunger gap. Lack of variety in the medieval diet was another source of suffering. While we today can enjoy fruits and vegetables from around the world year-round, medieval people were entirely dependent on what could be grown locally and what was in season. For most of the year, peasants subsisted on a monotonous diet of porridge made from barley, oats, or rye, accompanied by whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plots. Onions, leeks, and cabbages were among the hardiest crops, but these provided little in the way of essential vitamins and minerals. The seasonal nature of food availability meant that late winter and early spring were particularly difficult times. By then, the previous year's harvest would be running low, and the new crops had not yet matured. This period, known as the hunger gap, was when malnutrition was most severe and death rates highest. Children born during these lean months often suffered from stunted growth and weakened immune systems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The Great Famine of 1315. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 represents perhaps the darkest chapter in medieval food history. A catastrophic combination of climate change, crop failures, and political instability plunged much of Europe into 7 years of starvation and misery. Contemporary chronicles paint a horrifying picture of the suffering endured by ordinary people. The Flemish chronicler Guillaume de Nangus wrote that men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, while other accounts describe people resorting to consuming grass and bark in their desperation. The famine hit different regions with varying severity, but nowhere was spared entirely. In some areas of the Low Countries in Scandinavia, mortality rates reached 10 to 25% of the population. The German city of Erfurt saw an average of 16 deaths per day during the worst years, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. The psychological impact of the famine was as devastating as the physical toll, creating a generation scarred by the memory of extreme hunger and loss. Royal feasts and noble excess. The contrast between medieval food culture and our modern abundance is striking. Today, we can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and vegetables from around the world, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We have access to a variety of foods that would have been unimaginable to even the wealthiest medieval nobles. The rare medieval feast provided a stunning contrast to daily reality. Royal banquets featured dozens of elaborate dishes, roasted peacocks, sugar sculptures, and delicacies flavored with precious spices. These displays of culinary opulence served not just as entertainment, but as powerful demonstrations of wealth and status, reminding all present of the vast gulf between the privileged few and the struggling masses. Even these magnificent feasts came with their own dangers. Without understanding of food safety, even the wealthy were vulnerable to food poisoning and other ailments. The death of King John of England in 1216, attributed to consuming spoiled peaches, serves as a reminder that in the medieval world, every meal was potentially hazardous. Social hierarchy and legal inequality, as we've witnessed the harsh realities of medieval life unfold before us, from the brutal justice system to the constant struggle for sustenance. We begin to see how these hardships carve deep divisions into the very fabric of society. The strange laws we've explored were not merely quirks of a bygone era, but tools that reinforced a rigid hierarchy where one's birth determined one's fate with merciless precision. Picture, if you will, a world where the accident of your birth could sentence you to a lifetime of back-breaking labor, while others enjoyed lives of leisure and abundance, simply because they emerged from the right womb. This was the reality of medieval Europe, where society was stratified into three distinct orders, each as separate as oil and water, yet bound together by invisible chains of obligation and dependence. At the pinnacle of this pyramid sat the nobility, those who fought and ruled. These were the lords and ladies who lived in stone castles that pierced the sky like monuments to power. Their days were filled with courtly pursuits, elaborate ceremonies, and the intricate dance of politics. They wore silk and velvet, dined on exotic delicacies, and spoke in refined tongues that marked them as clearly as any coat of arms. For them, the strange laws we've encountered were tools of control, weapons to be wielded against those beneath them. The three orders of society below them, yet still elevated above the masses, stood the clergy, those who prayed. These men and women of God possessed a different kind of power, one that claimed dominion over souls rather than bodies. They lived in monasteries and cathedrals, surrounded by illuminated manuscripts and sacred relics. Their influence stretched into every corner of life, from the bedroom to the marketplace, dictating not just what people believed, but how they lived, ate, and even thought. And at the base of this structure, supporting the weight of the entire edifice on their bent backs, toiled the peasantry, those who worked. These were the vast majority of Europe's population, bound to the land like trees rooted in soil, unable to move or change their station without permission from their betters. They lived in hovels of mud and thatch, their hands perpetually stained with dirt, their backs permanently curved from endless labor. Justice for the privileged, legal system we've explored, served to maintain these divisions with ruthless efficiency. The very concept of justice itself was different depending on which rung of the ladder you occupied. A noble who harmed a peasant might pay a fine, while a peasant who stole bread could face the gallows. The trial by combat that seemed so absurd to our modern eyes made perfect sense in a world where physical prowess was seen as a divine gift, where God was believed to favor the righteous with strength and skill. Consider the tale of Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a minor lord who found himself accused of wrongdoing by a peasant named William. The accusation was serious, the evidence compelling. Yet when the matter came before the court, it was not witnesses or physical proof that would determine guilt or innocence. Instead, the two men faced each other in a circle of packed earth, armed with sword and shield. while nobles and commoners alike gathered to watch divine justice unfold. William, though strong from years of farm labor, had never held a sword in anger. His calloused hands, so skilled with plow and scythe, fumbled with the unfamiliar weight of steel. Sir Geoffrey, trained from childhood in the arts of war, moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior. The outcome was never truly in doubt. When William fell, his blood seeping into the earth he had worked all his life, the crowd nodded in satisfaction. God had spoken. Justice had been served, but this was justice only in the eyes of those who crafted the system. To the peasants watching their champion perish, it was yet another reminder of their powerlessness, another demonstration that the law existed not to protect them, but to keep them in their place. That marriage and family, under medieval lawing, the midst of all this legal chaos and social upheaval, one might wonder how ordinary people found any semblance of order in their daily lives. The answer lay not in the grand pronouncements of kings or the elaborate rituals of courts, but in the quiet, persistent traditions that governed the most intimate aspects of medieval existence: marriage, family, and inheritance. These were the pillars upon which medieval society truly rested. Yet even here, the strange laws of Europe cast their peculiar shadows. Marriage in medieval times was far from the romantic ideal we might imagine today. It was a legal contract, often arranged by families and governed by a bewildering array of rules that varied, not just from kingdom to kingdom, but from village to village. The Church insisted that marriage was a sacred sacrament requiring the free consent of both parties. Yet this noble principle was constantly undermined by the harsh realities of medieval life. Parents arranged marriages for children as young as 12, and consent was often assumed rather than freely given. Consider the strange case of marriage by capture, a practice that lingered in some remote corners of Europe well into the late medieval period. In certain regions of Scotland and Ireland, a man could legally claim a woman as his wife simply by taking her to his household for a year and a day. If she bore him a child during this time, the marriage was considered absolutely binding regardless of her initial consent. This barbaric practice was justified by ancient customs that predated Christianity. Yet it somehow persisted alongside the Church's teachings about holy matrimony. The complex web of marriage law even. Stranger were the laws governing marriage impediments, the reasons why a marriage might be forbidden or annulled. The Church maintained extensive lists of relationships that barred marriage, extending far beyond what we might consider reasonable. Cousins to the seventh degree were forbidden to marry, meaning that anyone who shared a great-grandparent was considered too closely related. In small medieval communities, where everyone was related to everyone else in some distant way, finding a suitable spouse who wasn't technically a forbidden relative became a nearly impossible task. This led to the peculiar practice of purchasing dispensations, essentially buying permission from the Church to marry someone you weren't supposed to. The wealthy could afford these papal permits, but the poor were left to either live together unmarried or remain celibate. It created a system where the fundamental human right to marry was determined not by love or compatibility, but by one's ability to navigate complex genealogies and pay ecclesiastical fees. Women and property rights. Women faced particular challenges under medieval inheritance law. Upon marriage, a woman's property typically passed to her husband's control under the legal principle known as coverture. She essentially ceased to exist as a separate legal entity, becoming what the law termed a femme covert, a covered woman, hidden under her husband's legal identity. Her property, her debts, even her crimes became his responsibility. She could not make contracts, file lawsuits, or write a will without his permission. Yet here too, medieval law revealed its contradictory nature. Widows often enjoyed rights that married women were denied. A widow was entitled to her dower, typically 1/3 of her deceased husband's estate, which she could control independently. Some widows became powerful figures in their communities, running businesses and managing vast estates. The law recognized them as femme sole women alone, with nearly the same legal rights as men. It was a strange system that granted women more freedom in widowhood than they had ever enjoyed in marriage. Children. In the medieval legal system, the treatment of children under medieval law was equally complex and often harsh by modern standards. Children were considered miniature adults, subject to the same legal penalties as their elders. A child as young as 7 could be tried for theft and face severe punishment if found guilty. There was no concept of juvenile justice or rehabilitation. Children were expected to contribute to the family economy from an early age, and their labor was considered the property of their parents. Apprenticeship laws created a peculiar form of temporary bondage where children as young as 10 or 12 were bound to masters for terms of 7 to 10 years. During this time, they belonged entirely to their master, who could punish them, transfer their services, or even bequeath them to another master in his will. The apprentice had no right to leave, no right to marry without permission, and no right to keep any wages they might earn. In return, they received food, shelter, and training in a trade if they survived the often brutal treatment. Nighttime laws and curfews. As the sun set over medieval Europe, another set of laws came into effect. These were the laws of the night, stranger and more severe than anything the daylight hours could conjure. The concept of curfew, from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire, was far more than a simple instruction to bank ones. It was a comprehensive legal framework that governed every aspect of nocturnal life. When the curfew bell rang, typically at sunset or shortly thereafter, all fires were to be extinguished, all doors barred, and all honest citizens were expected to retire to their homes. To be found wandering the streets after curfew, without proper authorization, was itself a crime, punishable by fine, imprisonment, or worse. Yet the definition of proper authorization varied wildly from place to place, creating a labyrinthine system of nocturnal permissions that could trap the unwary. In London, a citizen might carry a lantern as proof of legitimate business. But in Paris, the same lantern could be viewed with suspicion, as only thieves and cutthroats had need of artificial light in the honest darkness. Some towns required written passes from local magistrates, while others demanded the accompaniment of a recognized citizen of good standing. The night watch and enforcement. Enforcement of curfew laws fell to the night watch, a peculiar institution that embodied many of the contradictions inherent in medieval justice. These men, often volunteers or conscripts from the local population, were charged with maintaining order during the most lawless hours. Yet they themselves operated in a legal gray area, wielding authority that was both absolute and tenuous. A watchman could detain, question, and even arrest citizens, but his actions were subject to review by daylight authorities, who might have little sympathy for the challenges of nocturnal law enforcement. Consider the case of Thomas Brightwell, a baker from York, who ran afoul of these nighttime regulations in the winter of 1348. Thomas had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to begin preparing the day's bread. The ovens needed time to heat, and the dough required hours of careful attention. Yet when he stepped outside to gather wood for his fires, he was immediately seized by the night watch, who accused him of violating curfew. Despite his protest that he was engaged in legitimate trade, Thomas found himself dragged before the bailiff at first light. The bailiff faced a dilemma that perfectly illustrated the absurdities of medieval law. On one hand, Thomas had clearly violated the letter of the curfew ordinance by being abroad before dawn. On the other hand, his profession required him to begin work while darkness still reigned, and the town depended on his bread for daily sustenance. The solution, typical of medieval jurisprudence, was both ingenious and bizarre. Thomas was fined for his violation, but granted a special license to be abroad before dawn. provided he carried a blessed candle from the church and recited 3 Hail Marys if challenged by the watch. Reflection on medieval justice. These strange laws were not merely the products of backward thinking or primitive legal understanding. They reflected sophisticated attempts to maintain social order in a world very different from our own. Medieval society faced challenges we can barely imagine: constant warfare, devastating plagues, economic uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of famine. In such a world, laws needed to be more than mere rules. They needed to be mechanisms for preserving the delicate balance that kept communities together. The apparent strangeness of these laws often dissolves when we understand the context in which they operated. What seems bizarre to us made perfect sense to people living in a world where divine judgment was a daily reality, where community harmony was essential for survival, and where justice needed to be both seen and felt by all members of society. As we drift deeper into the medieval world, we begin to see that these strange laws were threads in a complex tapestry of belief, tradition, and practical necessity. They tell us not just about legal systems, but about entire ways of understanding the world, human nature, and our place in the grand scheme of creation. The legacy of medieval law. The legacy of these medieval legal systems can still be seen in many aspects of modern law, from the adversarial nature of court proceedings to the use of juries to determine guilt or innocence. But the evolution from the brutal and arbitrary justice of the Middle Ages to the more humane and rational legal systems of today has been a long and gradual process, marked by countless struggles for reform and recognition of human dignity. As we close this exploration of medieval Europe's strange laws, we find ourselves at a crossroads between understanding the past and recognizing our present freedoms. The bizarre legal traditions we've examined reveal a world where justice was often arbitrary, where social status determined legal outcomes, and where the powerful crafted laws to maintain their dominance over the vulnerable. These medieval legal systems, for all their apparent strangeness to modern eyes, served specific purposes within their historical context. They reinforced social hierarchies, maintained religious authority, and attempted to preserve order in societies marked by uncertainty and upheaval. Elaborate rituals surrounding trials by combat or ordeal provided a sense of divine intervention in human affairs, while dress codes and trade regulations sought to maintain clear distinctions between social classes. Understanding our progress, yet beneath the surface of these legal frameworks lay deeper human truths that transcend the medieval period. The struggle for justice, the desire for fair treatment, and the tension between authority and individual freedom are themes that resonate across centuries. The medieval peasant who faced trial by ordeal shared the same fundamental human need for justice as any modern citizen navigating today's legal system. The corruption and inequality we've witnessed in these historical legal systems serve as powerful reminders of why the development of modern jurisprudence, with its emphasis on evidence-based proceedings, equal treatment under law, and protection of individual rights, represents such a significant advancement in human civilization. The arbitrary nature of medieval justice, where a lord's whim could determine life or death, underscores the precious nature of the legal protections we now take for granted. Final reflections as you drift off to sleep tonight. Perhaps you can find comfort in knowing that while the medieval world was often harsh and unpredictable, it was also populated by individuals who, despite the constraints of their time, sought meaning, justice, and dignity in their daily lives. Their struggles and aspirations, filtered through the strange lens of medieval law, remind us that the human spirit's quest for fairness and freedom is indeed timeless. The strange laws of medieval Europe, in all their bizarre complexity, ultimately tell a story not just of the past, but of humanity's ongoing journey toward a more just and equitable world. In understanding where we came from, we better appreciate where we are and perhaps gain wisdom for where we're going. Sleep well. Knowing that the elaborate legal rituals and arbitrary judgments of the medieval world have given way to systems that, while imperfect, strive to treat all people with dignity and fairness under the law. Rest peacefully, and let the whispers of history carry you toward dreams where justice truly serves all, and where the lessons of the past illuminate the path toward a more compassionate future. The strange laws of medieval Europe remind us that progress is possible, and that each generation has the power to build a more just world than the one they inherited. The peculiar customs of medieval guilds as car to build a more just world than the one they inherited. The peculiar customs of medieval inherited. The peculiar customs of medieval guilds as we drift deeper into the realm of peaceful slumber. Let us explore another fascinating aspect of medieval life, the intricate world of guild regulations that governed every trade and craft in medieval towns and cities. These associations of artisans and merchants created their own elaborate legal systems, complete with initiation rituals, secret knowledge, and punishments that could rival any royal court. The guild system emerged in the 11th and 12th centuries as a response to the growing complexity of urban commerce. Each trade, from bakers to blacksmiths, from weavers to wine merchants, formed its own exclusive brotherhood with rules so detailed and specific that they covered everything, from the precise ingredients that could be used in bread to the exact number of threads that must be woven into a bolt of cloth. Consider the case of Master Benedict, a fictional goldsmith in 13th century Paris. To become a member of the Goldsmiths Guild, Benedict had to serve 7 years as an apprentice, during which time he was forbidden from marrying, owning property, or even speaking to customers directly. After completing his apprenticeship, he faced another 5 years as a journeyman, traveling from town to town to perfect his craft under different masters. Only then could he attempt to become a master craftsman himself, but this required creating a masterpiece, a work of such exceptional quality that it would be judged worthy by the guild elders. If his masterpiece was rejected, Benedict might have to wait years before attempting again, all while supporting himself through lesser work that barely paid enough to survive. Guild secrets and monopolies. The guilds jealously guarded their trade secrets, creating elaborate systems of apprenticeship and initiation that ensured knowledge was passed down only to approved members. The glassmakers of Venice developed techniques for creating crystal-clear glass that they protected so fiercely that revealing the secrets to outsiders was punishable by death. Guild members who attempted to practice their trade in other cities could face severe penalties, including the destruction of their tools and permanent banishment from their profession. These monopolistic practices extended to the most mundane aspects of commerce. In medieval London, the bakers' guild specified not only the ingredients that could be used in different types of bread, but also the exact weights, the permitted markup on prices, and even the days of the week when certain varieties could be sold. A baker who violated these rules might find his entire day's production confiscated and distributed to the poor, while he faced fines that could bankrupt his business. The Weavers' Guild in Flanders developed regulations so complex that they required a separate class of guild inspectors, whose sole job was to examine finished cloth for compliance with quality standards. Fabric that failed inspection was publicly burned in the market square, serving both as punishment for the weaver and warning to others who might be tempted to cut corners. The role of women in guild society. Women occupied a peculiar position within the guild system, sometimes enjoying rights and opportunities denied to them in aspects of medieval society. In certain trades, particularly those involving textiles, brewing, and food preparation, women could become full guild members with the same rights and responsibilities as men. The story of Dame Margaret, a fictional alewife in 14th century Norwich, illustrates both the opportunities and limitations faced by women in guild society. As the widow of a brewer, Margaret inherited not only her husband's business, but also his membership in the Brewers Guild. She found herself with the authority to take on apprentices, vote on guild policies, and participate in the elaborate ceremonial processions that marked religious festivals. Yet Margaret's position remained precarious in ways that her male colleagues never experienced. If she remarried, her new husband would automatically assume control of her business and guild membership. If she remained unmarried but took a romantic partner, she could be expelled from the guild for moral impropriety. The same behavior that was overlooked in male guild members could result in social and economic ruin for a woman. Guild justice and internal court siege. Guild operated its own court system with the authority to judge disputes between members, punish violations of trade regulations, and even impose sentences that included fines, imprisonment, and expulsion from the trade. These guild courts developed their own elaborate procedures and legal traditions that often conflicted with royal or ecclesiastical law. The case of Master Robert, a fictional carpenter in 15th century Cologne, demonstrates the complexity of guild justice. When Robert was accused by a competitor of using inferior wood in a church altar, the matter was brought before the Carpenters' Guild Court rather than any civil authority. The guild appointed a panel of master craftsmen to examine the disputed work, hear testimony from witnesses, and render judgment. The proceedings took on an almost religious character, with guild members gathering in their ceremonial robes while oaths were sworn on sacred relics kept in the guild hall. When Robert was found guilty of the charges, his punishment was both practical and symbolic. He was required to rebuild the altar at his own expense, pay a substantial fine to the guild treasury, and publicly confess his transgression during the next guild feast. But perhaps most devastating of all, Robert was forbidden from taking on any major commissions for 2 years, effectively destroying his reputation and livelihood. The guild's judgment was final, with no appeal to higher courts, demonstrating the enormous power these trade associations wielded over their members' lives, ceremonial life, and seasonal celebrations. The guilds created elaborate ceremonial lives that provided structure and meaning for their members beyond the purely economic functions of trade regulation. Each guild had its own patron saint, its own feast days, and its own traditions of charitable giving and community service. These celebrations served to reinforce guild solidarity while displaying the wealth and status of successful craftsmen. During the annual Corpus Christi processions in medieval York, each guild was responsible for performing mystery plays that told biblical stories related to their particular trade. The shipbuilders performed the story of Noah's Ark. The bakers reenacted the miracle of the loaves and fishes, and the goldsmiths presented the visit of the Magi with their precious gifts. These performances required enormous investments of time and money from guild members, who competed fiercely to create the most impressive displays. The elaborate costumes, mechanical devices, and special effects used in these plays rivaled anything seen in royal courts, while the theological knowledge required to interpret complex biblical narratives demonstrated that medieval craftsmen were far more sophisticated than stereotypes might suggest. Economic control and market regulation. The guild's control over medieval commerce extended far beyond quality standards to encompass virtually every aspect of economic life in medieval towns. They determined who could practice each trade, where shops could be located, what prices could be charged, and even which days of the week different goods could be sold. This system created a web of interdependencies that made medieval urban life both stable and restrictive. The Tanners Guild, for example, had to coordinate with the Butchers Guild to ensure a steady supply of animal hides, while both groups negotiated with the Leatherworkers Guild regarding the processing and sale of finished products. Any disruption in this carefully balanced system could have cascading effects throughout the local economy. The guilds also served as early forms of social insurance, providing support for members who became ill, disabled, or widowed. Guild funds paid for medical care, supported orphans, and provided decent burials for members who died in poverty. In return, members were expected to contribute regularly to guild treasuries and participate in the mutual aid that held these communities together. Apprenticeship and the transfer of knowledge. The apprenticeship system developed by the guilds created one of the most sophisticated methods of knowledge transfer in the pre-modern world. Young people, typically bound to masters between the ages of 12 and 14, entered into contracts that governed every aspect of their lives for periods ranging from 5 to 9 years. Consider the daily routine of young Thomas, a fictional apprentice to a silversmith in medieval Venice. Thomas would rise before dawn to prepare his master's workshop, cleaning tools, organizing materials, and heating the forges to the precise temperatures required for different types of metalwork. His early years would be spent on the most basic tasks, sweeping floors, running errands, and mixing the chemical compounds used in various processes. Only gradually would Thomas be permitted to handle precious metals or learn the closely guarded secrets of his trade. The progression from apprentice to journeyman to master followed a carefully structured curriculum that ensured both quality control and preservation of traditional techniques. The master craftsman served not only as teacher but also as surrogate parent, responsible for Thomas's moral education as well as his technical training. Apprentices lived in their masters' households, ate at their tables, and were subject to their discipline in all matters. This created intimate bonds between master and student that often lasted lifetimes, forming networks of loyalty and mutual obligation that strengthened guild solidarity. Decline and transformation. As we approach the end of our medieval journey, it's worth noting that the guild system that had dominated European commerce for centuries began to decline in the late medieval period. The rise of merchant capitalism, the expansion of international trade, and the growing power of centralized monarchies all contributed to the erosion of guild authority. New manufacturing techniques and economic theories challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which guild society had been built. The idea that competition was harmful, the prices should be fixed by tradition rather than market forces, and that trade secrets should be jealously guarded began to seem outdated in an increasingly connected world. Yet the legacy of the medieval guilds lived on in countless ways. The emphasis on quality craftsmanship, the importance of professional education, and the concept of trade associations continued to influence European commerce long after the guilds themselves had faded into history. Many modern professional organizations, from medical associations to trade unions, can trace their origins back to the guild system of medieval Europe. The wisdom of simple lives. As we conclude our exploration of these peculiar laws and customs of medieval Europe, we might pause to consider what these long-vanished societies can teach us about human nature and social organization. Despite their many flaws and limitations, medieval communities succeeded in creating systems that provided meaning, purpose, and security for their members in ways that our modern world sometimes struggles to match. The medieval emphasis on community obligation, mutual aid, and shared responsibility offers valuable lessons for contemporary society. While we would never want to return to the rigid hierarchies and limited opportunities of medieval life, we might still learn from their understanding of human interdependence and social solidarity. The craftsmen who spent decades perfecting their skills, the guild members who supported each other through hardship and celebration, the communities that came together to create magnificent works of art and architecture. All these remind us that human flourishing depends not just on individual achievement, but on the strength of the bonds that connect us to one another. A gentle conclusion as the final echoes of our medieval journey fade into the peaceful darkness of night. Let us carry with us both the lessons of the past and hope for the future. The strange laws and customs we've explored remind us that human societies are always works in progress, constantly evolving and adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The medieval world, for all its hardships and limitations, was also a world of remarkable creativity, resilience, and community spirit. The people who lived under these peculiar laws were not so different from us. They loved their families, took pride in their work, sought meaning in their lives, and dreamed of better futures for their children. Their struggles with justice, equality, and human dignity continue to resonate today, reminding us that the work of building fair and compassionate societies is never finished. Each generation must take up this work anew, learning from the past while striving to create something better for the future. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that you are part of this continuing human story. Rest well and dream of a world where the best insights of the past combine with the possibilities of the future to create societies worthy of human dignity and hope. The strange laws of medieval Europe have much to teach us, but perhaps their greatest lesson is simply this: that human beings, in every age and under every circumstance, continue to strive for justice, community, and meaning in their lives. May your dreams be filled with the quiet wisdom of ages past and the bright promise of days yet to come. Good night, and may you wake refreshed and inspired by the remarkable journey of human civilization that continues to unfold around us every day.